They told me I was too precise for the chaos of field logistics. That's how my career ended, on a hot Tuesday morning inside a prefab steel office at Camp Victory, Niger. My name is Nathan Keller. I'm 37, and for the past 14 years, I'd been the Army's go-to problem solver when it came to tracking millions of dollars in military gear across deployments in Iraq, South Korea, and West Africa. That morning, I handed Colonel Bryce Maddox a meticulously detailed report showing $6.1 million in missing high-value equipment, drones, encrypted communications kits, ballistic optics. Maddox didn't even glance at the flash drive. "You're not a team player, Keller," he said, like we were arguing over office coffee supplies. The air conditioner rattled behind him as the desert heat bled through the thin walls. I stood there, uniform pressed, jaw tight, wondering when doing the right thing became an act of defiance. "Sir, these losses aren't just budget discrepancies. This gear could save lives." He looked up for the first time, smiled slightly, and said, "Exactly why you shouldn't worry about them." That's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. It was a cover-up. And I had just become its biggest threat. I stepped out of Maddox's office and into the blinding heat. The wind carried that familiar dry sting, dust and jet fuel, and somewhere in the distance, a Black Hawk spun up for takeoff. I made my way back to the supply control office, a converted container near the motor pool, and slid into my desk chair. The screensaver danced across my monitor, but my mind replayed the colonel's words. "You're not a team player." I'd heard it before, usually right before someone tried to bury something. I pulled up our last 3 shipping logs. Something didn't add up. 10 crates of thermal scopes had been marked as combat loss en route to a forward unit operating north of Maradi, but the convoy they were supposedly in, it had never left the wire. No patrol logs, no GPS pings, no incident reports. They'd just vanished on paper. Across from me, Specialist Ruben Valdez walked in, balancing an armful of inventory binders. "Sir, the drone parts from Storage Base C are gone. Again. I triple-checked yesterday." I nodded slowly, already pulling up that manifest. 2 Raven drones, 1 encrypted tablet, 3 sets of batteries, all marked as transferred 2 weeks ago. But the receiving unit? Listed as deactivated. A shell. "That doesn't make sense," Valdez muttered. "It's not supposed to," I replied, eyes fixed on the screen. "Run a trace on the request signature. Who authorized it?" He hesitated. "Sir, it's Colonel Maddox." I didn't respond. My stomach turned in a slow, sinking spiral. These weren't just admin errors. This was coordinated. The next hour blurred into numbers and acronyms. I cross-referenced the S4 logistics portal with movement orders from Central Command. A pattern emerged. Gear was being moved on paper to units that no longer existed, or diverted to training bases with no record of ever receiving the shipments. Each transfer was wrapped in just enough plausible deniability, fog of war explanations, combat loss tags, equipment redundancy flags, but beneath it all the same signatures appeared, same handoffs, same override codes, same final authorization. Maddox. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the back room. The locked cabinet held archived physical logs, paper copies, shipment receipts, hand-signed verification sheets. I flipped through the last 3 months, highlighting mismatched numbers and forged initials. By the time the sun dropped behind the hangars, I had filled an entire notepad with discrepancies. Something massive was happening under our feet. And, if I was right, someone was stealing millions in gear and ghosting it through a system I'd spent over a decade mastering. And now, I had proof. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Not yet. But because deep down I knew where this was heading, and what it would cost me. That old instinct, the one I'd buried beneath years of protocol and professionalism, had kicked in hard. This was not just fraud. This was betrayal. And I couldn't let it go. I stared at the ceiling of my bunk, the quiet hum of bass generators in the background, and thought back to Pittsburgh, where I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. My dad, Staff Sergeant Paul Keller, retired, lost half his hearing from an IED in Mosul. Spent the rest of his life fixing garage doors and teaching me the difference between shortcuts and standards. He used to say, "You can't half do a job and still call it service." When I told him I was enlisting, he just nodded. Didn't say I'm proud, didn't say be careful. Just handed me his old watch and said, "If you're going to wear the uniform, mean it." And I did. I joined in 2008, barely 19, and ended up in Afghanistan my first year. While most guys were counting kills or days to go home, I was building out supply chains, tracing how a crate of ammo got from Kandahar to the guys pinned down in Ghazni. I had a knack for it. Not just moving gear, but seeing the flaws, the mean gaps where things got lost, where bureaucracy turned into excuses. By 2015, I was stationed in South Korea, coordinating cross-border logistics drills. People started calling me Keller the Clock, not because I was fast, but because I was precise. I double-checked manifests, verified by voice, demanded paper backups even when the Army was pushing full digital. Some laughed at me for it. Most just came to me when something critical went missing. But the truth is, I didn't care about paperwork. I cared about the soldier in the dust, waiting for a tourniquet that might not arrive because someone up the chain fudged a form to make their numbers look cleaner. I cared about the kid relying on thermal goggles that never made it out of inventory because someone siphoned them off for profit. That's what this was about. Not rules, not promotion, not pride. It was about trust. And someone, somewhere, was burning it to the ground while the rest of us looked the other way. Not me. Not this time. By morning, I was operating like a man on borrowed time. I arrived at the office before sunrise, before the coffee machine had even kicked on. Valdez wasn't in yet. Good. I didn't want questions. I didn't want small talk. I wanted answers. I started with the obvious. The transfer codes used on all the suspicious shipments. Maddox's signature was on the surface, but someone had to input the codes. That meant a digital trail. I pulled up the logistics portal and backtracked movement records on the stolen drone parts from Storage Bay C. Buried beneath layers of normal shipping data was a sequence of overrides that bypassed requisition queues entirely. These weren't forged. They were real codes from real officers, but they were being misused with surgical precision. I checked access logs, Maddox again, but also a name I hadn't seen in over a year, Captain June Marks, formerly stationed in Camp Humphreys, South Korea, where I'd done a temporary rotation last spring. I remembered her, quiet, sharp, ran systems with the kind of efficiency you don't get without cutting corners. She disappeared from the system right after a shipment of encrypted radios went missing in transport. That was my first signal. This wasn't isolated. This was interbase. So I dug deeper. Between my past rotations and current clearances, I still had access to some archived logistics records from South Korea, Kuwait, and Fort Bragg. I started cross-referencing part numbers, especially high-value ones, thermal optics, SATCOM components, weapon mod kits. Same story, marked lost, damaged, or recycled for training purposes. But the receiving units were either deactivated or didn't match any corresponding missions. I organized my findings into a grid, just like I did in Afghanistan when tracking shipments across mountain routes. Patterns emerged. Same parts, same phrasing and reports, same 3 or 4 digital signatures across multiple regions. It wasn't just Maddox, it was a network, and someone was ghosting millions in military equipment across continents, laundering it through paperwork and making it vanish into thin air, until it likely reappeared in private hands or black market channels. I decided to get physical. Valdez had returned by then. I gave him a harmless task, inventory scanning, while I slipped over to Hangar 6, where incoming and outgoing crates were staged for customs inspection. I flashed my credentials at the young MP and found the row marked for outbound international transfer. A black shipping container, clean, no markings. According to the manifest, it was loaded with expired generator parts bound for destruction at a civilian facility in Morocco. I popped the seal. Inside were sealed weapons cases, brand new, thermal goggles, recon drone batteries, ballistic grade, armor inserts. None of it logged correctly, none of it tagged. I snapped photos and resealed the crate. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from confirmation. This wasn't just an anomaly or internal sloppiness. This was theft, fraud, and endangerment on a scale I hadn't thought possible inside U.S. military operations. I returned to my office and began building the file. Screenshots, backdated reports, serial numbers, source codes. I didn't know how long I had before someone caught wind of what I was compiling, but I knew if I didn't act fast, this would get buried like everything else. Maddox wasn't sloppy. He was protected. No one moved gear this precisely across multiple commands without someone covering tracks in Washington. By 0200 hours, I had over 140 pages of evidence, flagged, indexed, cross-referenced, but I hadn't sent it yet. Because once I did, everything would change. This was no longer just my job. It was war against a system that had started rotting from the inside, and I was going to be the one to expose it. At 0310 hours, I uploaded the file. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet keystroke, a blinking cursor and a confirmation screen that read, "Submission received command audit channel, confidential clearance." I encrypted a second copy, stored it on a flash drive, and mailed it through diplomatic post addressed to a contact I trusted at the Army Criminal Investigation Division, a lieutenant colonel I'd met during a joint training mission at Fort Hood. I included a handwritten note. This isn't just Maddox. This is a chain. By sunrise, I knew I'd stepped off a ledge with no harness. At 0830, my access badge failed at the mess hall. By 0900, I was locked out of the base logistics system. By 0930, 2 military police escorted me to my quarters for a mandatory review of conduct. I asked what I was being reviewed for. They wouldn't say. One of them wouldn't meet my eyes. In my room, I found a sealed folder on my bunk. Order of discharge, insubordination, conduct detrimental to unit cohesion, inability to adapt to operational fluidity. I stared at the language, sanitized, vague, and damning. No mention of the $6 million, no mention of the report, no chance to appeal. Just like that, 14 years of service were being erased with bureaucratic precision. Colonel Maddox called me into his office 2 hours later. His tone was clipped professional. He handed me a manila envelope with a checklist of gear to return, including my laptop, clearance fob, and any classified materials in my possession. You'll be off base by 1600. Transport to Niamey departs at 1800. From there, commercial flight to Dulles. I looked him dead in the eyes. You're not even trying to hide it. He didn't blink. The Army is a living system, Warrant Officer Keller, and like any system, it sheds parts that can't evolve, or threatens what's feeding on it, I said flatly. He stood up, smiled. You should be proud. You've made things cleaner. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about me making noise. This was about eliminating a variable. Maddox didn't need to fight me. He needed to delete me, quietly, without headlines, without a ripple. I signed the checklist, saluted, walked out. Back at the barracks, Valdez found me folding my uniforms into a duffel. "Sir, what's going on?" His voice cracked. "Orders changed," I said evenly. "It happens." He looked confused, angry. "But you're the one keeping this place together. Everyone knows it." I wanted to tell him the truth, that I'd uncovered a theft ring that spanned continents, that I'd filed a report no one wanted to acknowledge, that I was being silenced for doing what I was trained to do. But I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear I'd had my first year in the field when I realized not all officers were playing by the same rules. So I gave him what he needed to hear. Keep your head down, Valdez. Document everything. Trust the system. He nodded, but we both knew what I really meant. Don't be next. At 15:50, the same MPs came to walk me out. I turned over my gear, my clearance card, and the last 14 years of my identity. The armory clerk looked at my discharge packet and raised an eyebrow. Another one, huh? I didn't answer. Just stepped outside into the searing Niger heat. Duffel slung over my shoulder, wondering what kind of army punishes the soldier who keeps the inventory clean while protecting the officer who's bleeding it dry. But I also knew something Maddox didn't. The report was out, and there were people in the system who still remembered what honor looked like. The hum of the C-130's engines was a constant, dull roar beneath the weight in my chest. I sat in the back row, wedged between two cargo pallets and my own silence, watching the desert shrink through the small porthole window as we lifted off. No ceremony, no salute, no handshake, just a clipboard, a signature, and an escort to the airstrip like I was excess inventory being offloaded from the system. We landed in Miami, where a civilian contractor handed me a boarding pass to Washington D.C. and pointed to the commercial terminal. No eye contact, no explanation, just quiet execution, the kind you don't question if you want to keep your job. I found a corner seat by gate B-17 and sat with my duffel at my feet, watching people move through the terminal like they belonged there, like they weren't carrying the knowledge that billions of dollars in gear meant to protect soldiers was bleeding out of military pipelines, while the world looked the other way. I turned on my phone for the first time in days. 5 voicemails from my dad, 1 from my brother, 2 from unknown numbers, and 1 email, subject line blank, sender scrambled. I opened it. We saw your report. You're not alone. Keep your head down. They're watching. No signature, no attachments, just enough to keep me upright. I closed my eyes and let the message settle in my bones. Someone out there cared. But that didn't stop the anger. The cold, clean kind that burns slow and never really goes out. Not at Maddox. Not even at the Army. At the silence. At the ease with which they'd erased everything I was and labeled it non-compliant. I thought about Valdez, still logging inventory back at Camp Victory, probably confused and scared, waiting for someone to tell him what happened. I hoped he'd play it smart, keep his head down, not ask the wrong questions, because I'd seen how fast the system turns on its own. When they called boarding for Flight 239 to Dulles, I stood slowly, adjusting the strap on my bag. Around me, passengers scrolled on phones, laughed over overpriced airport food, and lived lives that didn't include court-martials or classified inventory fraud. I was leaving the battlefield, but the war wasn't over. I didn't have a badge, or a rank, or even a plan. But I had the truth, and someone, somewhere, was still listening. The flight to Dulles was half empty. I took a window seat near the back, kept my head down, and watched clouds roll by like they were hiding something underneath. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept looping back. Equipment logs, forged manifests, Maddox's voice, cold and polished. Every second of that last week was burned into me like combat muscle memory. But something else was keeping me awake now. That email. You're not alone. I landed just after midnight. The airport was quiet, sterile. I moved through customs, dragging my duffel with one hand and rubbing the ache out of my shoulder with the other. I expected a long Uber ride to nowhere and maybe a cheap hotel near Route 1. Instead, a man in a civilian jacket stepped into my path right outside baggage claim. Warrant Officer Nathan Keller? I froze. Not anymore, I said. He held up a badge just long enough for me to catch the seal. Criminal Investigation Division. I'm Captain James Radner. Mind walking with me a moment? We stepped outside into the heavy Virginia night, the air damp and buzzing with airport lights. He didn't say much at first, just kept pace beside me until we reached a black SUV parked at the curb. No markings, government plates. You filed a report through Command Audit Channel 3 days ago, he said. Yes. We've seen it. Read it. Verified enough to move forward. I stopped. So you believe me? His face didn't change. Let's just say it's not the first time Maddox's name has come up. But your file? It's different. It's thorough. It's dangerous. He opened the back door. We need to talk, off-site. I hesitated, then got in. The inside of the vehicle smelled like government upholstery and quiet pressure. Radner pulled out a secure tablet and handed it to me. On the screen was a folder labeled OP Shadow Circuit. Inside, I saw logistics anomalies from Kuwait, South Korea, Germany, even Djibouti. The same digital fingerprints I'd traced, the same shell unit names, the same overrides. You weren't just chasing Maddox, Radner said. You walked into something bigger, and we want you to help bring it down. I looked up at him, disbelief fading into something sharper. Purpose. I'm not in uniform anymore. No, he said, but right now we don't need soldiers. We need someone who knows how this system really works. For the first time in days, I felt the burn of adrenaline not from fear, but from something else. A second chance. 3 days later, I was sitting in a secure conference room at a federal building in Arlington, staring at a war room wall covered in maps, manifests, and redacted personnel files. Captain Radner hadn't been exaggerating. This thing was global, and I wasn't a footnote anymore. I was central. They gave me a temporary clearance badge and a seat across from two new faces. Agent Meredith Cho from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and Colonel Eli Travers, liaison from Army JAG. They didn't waste time. We've been tracking this theft network for 18 months, Cho said. Until your report, we didn't have anything solid to tie it all together. Travers slid a thick binder across the table. What you uncovered at Camp Victory matches exactly with irregularities at 4 other installations. The terminology, the fake requisitions, the contractor partnerships, even the inventory codes. Inside the binder were images I recognized. Serial tags from stolen thermal scopes, crate IDs from ghost shipments, and worst of all, internal memos signed off by people I'd once trained under. It's not just Maddox, I muttered. This goes way up. Yes, Radner said. And across South Korea, Kuwait, Poland, even Ramstein Air Base in Germany. What we're dealing with is a multi-continent laundering operation. Stolen military gear funneled into private defense contractors, foreign intermediaries, and shadow organizations using forged routing orders and embedded insiders. I leaned, back stunned. How much are we talking? Cho looked me dead in the eye. Conservatively, $60 million in equipment over the last 2.5 years, potentially double that. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was a battlefield of betrayal. They brought me in officially the next morning as a civilian contractor, logistics pattern analyst, and gave me a secure workspace in the basement level. I spent 16-hour days poring over data sets from 4 continents, movement logs, procurement orders, shipping schedules. And what I found made my stomach churn. At Al Udeid Air Base, there were combat loss records for equipment never assigned to any live unit. In Camp Humphreys, dozens of RFID tags had been cloned, creating digital ghost shipments that covered up real thefts. At Ramstein, gear labeled as training materials was routed out through front companies in Romania, only to reappear weeks later at private security firms in Africa and the Middle East. And it wasn't sloppy. It was engineered. Someone, or several someones, had built a system with layers of obfuscation. They used overlapping digital authorizations, moved gear during command transitions, and even rotated duty rosters to disrupt pattern detection. It was brilliant, terrifying, familiar. And it all followed the same fingerprints, Maddox's codes, Captain June Marks's overrides, and a third, unknown signatory, someone using the alias Oracle 9. The deeper I went, the more names surfaced. Some I recognized, some I wished I didn't. Then came the gut punch. Radner pulled me aside one evening, handed me a file with a photo clipped to the front. Captain Renee Talbot, a logistics officer I had trained personally 3 years ago in Texas, was on the list of flagged suspects. She'd authorized $3.2 million in comms equipment transfers in the last 6 months alone. She was smart, disciplined. I never saw it coming. That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed at the office, staring at shipment graphs and wondering how many other good people had gone bad, or how many were just scared into silence. Then came the report from Kuwait. An Army medic died during a training mission when the thermal imaging unit in his gear failed. The unit had been replaced days earlier. On paper, it was routine maintenance. In reality, it was a shell swap. The real gear had been stolen. He died blind in the sand because someone needed a payday. That was it. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about blood, and I wasn't going to let it happen again. 2 weeks later, we were ready to strike. The operation was codenamed Iron Spine. It spanned 5 countries, included over 40 agents, 3 military task forces, and a coordinated series of arrests scheduled to unfold within a 10-minute window across 4 time zones. The plan had to be airtight. No early leaks, no second chances. At 600 GMT, the first wave hit. I watched it all unfold from the CID Operations Center in Arlington. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of synchronized monitors streaming secure live feeds from Camp Victory, Ramstein, Camp Humphreys, and a contractor office in Nairobi. In Niger, military police surrounded Maddox's quarters before he finished his coffee. He opened the door wearing PT gear, half awake, and found himself face-to-face with 2 CID officers and a legal warrant signed by the Deputy Inspector General. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. He just nodded once and let them cuff him. They walked him out past a line of soldiers standing at attention, not for him but for the truth finally catching up. At Ramstein, a colonel who'd signed dozens of fake requisitions tried to shred his laptop before agents stormed his office. Too late. The data had already been copied weeks ago. At Camp Humphreys, June Marks attempted to flee through the back motor pool, but was intercepted before she cleared the gate. In Nairobi, 3 contractors were arrested while transferring untagged military gear into a black transport truck with falsified paperwork. One by one, the dominoes fell. It was clinical, swift, and quiet, just the way real justice often is. In total, 17 military personnel were detained. 2 civilian contractors were charged with trafficking in stolen government property. 1 former Army major was picked up at his home in Tampa, Florida, caught trying to wipe external drives before the arrest team breached his front door. But the moment I'd waited for came at 0613, when a feed from Camp Victory showed Maddox being loaded into a military transport vehicle. No uniform, no rank, no authority. Just a man who gambled on silence and lost to truth. I stood watching, arms crossed, jaw tight, until Agent Cho stepped beside me. "You did this," she said softly. I shook my head. No, they did this to themselves. I just pulled back the curtain. Colonel Travers approached with a printed report in hand. "You'll want to see this." It was an internal memo from Army Command. Effective immediately, the entire logistics protocol for interbase transfers was being rewritten, based on the forensic model we'd built from my original investigation. A system designed to hide was being rebuilt to expose. As I stood there watching the final pieces fall into place, I thought about the medic who died in Kuwait, about Valdez still logging crates, about my father, who told me never to wear the uniform unless I meant it. This wasn't vengeance, it was accountability. And for the first time in months, the Army was beginning to remember what that word actually meant. 3 weeks after the operation, I received an envelope marked Official Correspondence, Department of the Army. Inside was a letter, cold in tone but seismic in meaning. "Your administrative discharge is under formal review. Pending outcome, your service record may be amended to reflect honorable separation in light of new findings." I stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of what I'd risked. But it was something. And in this line of work, sometimes something is a mountain. Later that same afternoon, Captain Radner called me into his office. He pushed a plain white folder across the desk. "Defense Criminal Investigative Service wants you full-time," he said. "Senior Logistics Forensics Advisor. You'd be working out of Quantico, helping design fraud detection protocols and leading training on internal threat indicators. I flipped the folder open. The salary was solid. Federal benefits. A chance to build safeguards into the very system I once watched rot from the inside. And this time, I wouldn't be the one on the outside yelling into a void. That night I got a call from Keller. Just heard about the arrests. Everyone here's talking. They say you were the one who started it. I smiled into the quiet. I just followed the numbers. Well, he said, his voice cracking, some of us are still following your lead. After the call, I went for a walk along the Potomac near the memorials. The city buzzed around me with the calm chaos of normalcy, people living lives untouched by convoy manifests or falsified requisition codes. But somewhere, far from those flood-lit monuments, soldiers were preparing for night patrols, strapping on vests, checking goggles, trusting the gear would be there when they needed it most. That trust had almost been shattered, and I had helped hold the line. In the end, it wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about rank or restoring a title. It was about reclaiming purpose, about knowing that even when the system turns its back, you don't stop doing what's right. You dig in, you document, you speak up, and if you're lucky, if you're stubborn enough, the right people eventually start listening. I signed the offer letter the next morning, not because I wanted revenge, but because justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you work for every damn day.